Welcome, everybody. I'm excited today to introduce Julien Tierny, and he'll be telling us about Wasserstein distances, geodesics, and barycenters of merged trees.
All right. Well, thanks for the introduction, and hi, everyone. So it's a pleasure for me to present this work, which is a joint work with Mathieu Pont, Jules Vidal, and Julie Delon. So our work is motivated by the analysis and visualization of collections of large-scale data sets, and such as those that you can find in scientific imaging. And these collections are typically obtained by acquisition campaigns or numerical simulations. And the key challenge for the users is to try to make sense out of this collection. So, for example, in astrophysics, users typically consider volume data sets, such as this one here. And they try to produce the simulation to understand the evolution specifically of a structure that they call the cosmic web. But however, when they run a data production campaign, users are not confronted to just one single data set. For instance, the data typically evolves through time. And also, users do not look at only one variable, but usually at many, such as matter density, for instance, or dark matter density, temperature, pressure, and so on. And also, the data production itself is subject to input parameters, such as specific initial conditions in the simulation example. So this process results in a large collection of data sets that we call ensemble. And a key challenge here is to provide analysis tools to help users visualize and interpret the global trends in these ensembles. And such tools include clustering methods, dimensionality reduction, and so on. So the problem is that there's actually several problems given the size of the individual members of the ensemble, and standard tools or metrics such as the L2 norm are not necessarily relevant anymore. And plus, in scientific computing, the size of the members is currently a bottleneck in practice for the global analysis of the ensemble, and only a small fraction of the ensemble is actually stored to permanent storage. So to address this, there's this emerging strategy which consists in representing the ensemble by a collection of topological descriptors, such as persistence diagrams, for instance. And the good thing is that these are robust and they encode well the features of interest in the data. Plus, they require storage overhead, which is orders of magnitude smaller than the original data itself. So the strategy here consists in only storing these concise descriptors and running the analysis based on these. And this is the core topic of the ERC project called Tori, which we run here at Sorbonne University. So regarding the persistence diagram, there's obviously a vast literature which covers both theoretical and computational aspects, with fast algorithms for the comparison of diagrams, but also efficient techniques for the computation of more statistical objects, such as barycenters of diagrams. However, the persistence diagrams can have certain limitations, which can be problematic for certain applications. In particular, it's easy to come up with two distinct data sets for which the diagrams are identical. And this is the case in this example, where we have two Gaussian mixtures, Fi and Fj, and you have also a terrain representation on both sides. And the only difference is that we swapped the positions of the green and the white Gaussians from left to right. And it turns out that the two diagrams are identical in this case, although that for some applications it may be desirable to encode this variability. So in our work, we focus on merged trees, which is an alternate representation that I will detail next, which can be intuitively understood as a sort of generalization of the diagrams, which additionally encodes the merge history of the topological features. And this results in two distinct trees in this example, as the green Gaussian is immediately connected to the black one on the left through this valley here, and this is encoded by this horizontal segment. And on the right side, the green Gaussian is connected to the blue hill through this valley, and this is represented by this horizontal segment here. So our work ambitions to adapt existing tools for the analysis of persistence diagrams to the case of merge trees. In particular, we introduce a new metric between merge trees, And it is primarily motivated by computational aspects. We want to be able to compute it in practice for real life data sets. And then based on this metric, we extend previous work on diagrams for the computation of geodesics and barycenters of merge trees. And then we also have a unified framework for the computation of these objects with an open source implementation. And I'll also show the utility of this framework in specific applications.
And okay. Julien, can I ask a question?
Sure.
When you say generalized persistence diagrams, are you talking about zero-dimensional persistence diagrams? Yeah.
Yes, I've been a little fast getting to the. I'll be more specific now. Yeah.
Sorry, no, it's no fair to ask questions when you're just showing the background slide. So.
But please, if you have more questions, please do not hesitate. So the input that we have is a collection of n scalar fields, which are defined on an object M. And here you have a toy example on the right with the volume of a hand. And the scalar data that is shown with the color map going from light green at the bottom to light blue at the top. So in this example, the scalar field is simply the elevation of each point, but in practice, this corresponds to the data under study, such as the dark matter density in the astrophysics example of the beginning, or pixel values in images and so on. So the object M is typically modeled as a simplicial complex, as you can see in this cutaway view, which is fairly generic. So now we'll focus on the lower star filtration of this data, which is the sequence of nested subcomplexes obtained by adding the lower star of each vertex by increasing data values. And we know from Morse theory that the homology groups of the subcomplexes change exactly at the critical points of the function. And in the rest, of course, I will focus on the connected components of the subcomplexes. And basically, a new component will be created when you add a local minimum, and a component will be destroyed when it merges with another component, which was created before. And this is sometimes called the elder rule. And this is what we'll show in the following animation. So distinct components are created when you pass a local minima. And when two components merge at the saddle, the youngest of the two dies, and we record that change with a bar, as you can see here, which connects the critical point creating the feature to the one destroying the feature. And as we continue this process, other minima get connected to other saddle points, and so on and so forth, and up to the last one here. And eventually, we pair, by convention in our work, the global minimum whose component never dies with the global maximum. And overall, this gives what is known as the barcode of the connected components of the lower star filtration. And this barcode can be represented in 2D by using as x coordinate the data value for the creation of the feature, and using as y coordinate the birth and death values of the feature. So this is indeed the zero-dimensional persistence diagram, and we'll work on this in the rest of the talk. All right, so now we'd like to compare two data sets, Fi and Fj, based on their persistence diagram, and I will briefly review that to understand how we do it with merge trees. So for that, we use the Wasserstein distance between diagrams. This distance is established by solving an assignment problem. And the first step in the resolution of this problem in practice is to perturbate the input to make the problem balanced and therefore easily addressable with standard solvers. So for this, we will take the off-diagonal points of dj, and we will augment di with their diagonal projection. So for instance, this point here is the diagonal projection of this guy, and this point here is the diagonal projection of this guy, and this one is the diagonal projection of that one here. And we do the same thing in the other diagram. And at this point, we have a well-balanced assignment problem with the same number of points in both diagrams, and we want to find an optimal mapping from the points of one diagram to the other. So for this, we need to introduce the ground metric, and what is typically taken is the LQ norm. And we'll consider that the distance is 0 if both points are on the diagonal. So all of this so far is very standard. So now I will present the Wasserstein distance itself, and for that I will give a rather specific description on purpose in order to align it with the graph matching literature that we will review next. So for this, I will introduce the notion of partial assignment, For that, I will consider a subset pi of the off-diagonal points of di, and pi bar will be the rest of the off-diagonal points of di, which is, for instance, shown here in transparent. And we'll call a partial assignment a triplet, which is formed by bijective map phi, going from pi in di to pj in dj, and then the two sets of unmatched points in di and dj, which are namely pi bar and pj bar at the bottom. So once you have that, you can introduce the distance as the minimum of 3 terms over all possible partial assignments. And the first term evaluates the cost of matching each point pi to pj through this bijection. And the second term evaluates the cost of destroying the remaining unmapped features in pi bar. And this is done by mapping them to their diagonal projection, which is shown here, delta. And the third term evaluates the cost of creating the remaining features in pj bar. All right. So the above figure here illustrates a partial assignment for this example. You have the mapping phi here between some features in di and dj, and here you have some features which are destroyed, and here are some features which are created. Now, if we focus on the special case where the parameter q is equal to 2, we can easily introduce the notion of center between two diagrams, and this is the diagram that you see in black, that you can obtain by considering the midpoint of each assignment. And as a matter of fact, as described by Turner and colleagues for q equals 2, the linear interpolation of the assignments describes a geodesic in the space of diagrams equipped with this metric. And from a practical point of view, this is very convenient because it means that we can compute a geodesic between two diagrams by simply computing their distance and then interpolating the optimal assignment. Once this is established, we can introduce the notion of barycenter, which is a local minimizer of the fresh energy, which is simply the sum of the Wasserstein distances of the candidate D to the diagrams of the ensemble. All right, so now what we'd like to do in our work is essentially do the same things, but with the merged trees, which help us differentiate data sets a little better. So first, I will introduce the joint tree, which is a 1D simplicial complex obtained as the quotient space of the mesh M by an equivalence relation that says that 2 points P1 and P2 are equivalent if and only if they share the same data value and they belong to the same connected component of sublevel set. And similarly to the persistence diagram, the minima of the scalar data will map to leaves in that tree, and the internal nodes will correspond to saddle points as shown here. And here we complete the tree to the root of the global maximum of the data. So now in practice, it can be interesting to also consider the superlevel set components, in which case the tree is called a split tree instead of a joint tree. But for convenience, the term merge tree refers to any of these two. So now there's quite a direct relation between the merge tree and the zero-dimensional persistence diagram with the notion of branch decomposition. And by construction, the nodes of the merge tree correspond to the critical points creating and destroying the connected components of sublevel sets. So these are precisely the critical points tracked by the barcode. And thus we can directly identify in the tree the nodes corresponding to a given bar. And this is what we see here. Each pair of critical points involved in a single bar has the same color. And here the color denotes persistence. So now we can introduce the notion of persistent branch, which is the monotonic path on the tree which connects two critical points involved in a given persistence pair. So from a minimum up to a saddle. And the merge tree can be displayed in the plane according to its persistent branches. So for that, we just embed each branch of the barcode by putting its extremities at the y coordinates corresponding to their data values, and by adding a horizontal segment to denote the connections between the branches in the tree. So now, if you look at the diagram and the branch decomposition side by side, the relation is quite obvious. The branch decomposition captures exactly the same persistence pairs, the same bars as the diagram. And here you can see that the heights exactly coincide. But the merge tree additionally tracks who destroyed whom with the horizontal segments. So now, for convenience, we'll consider something that is called the branch decomposition tree, or BDT for short, which is just a dual representation where each persistent branch is represented by a node. And here we use the same color code. And each horizontal segment is represented by an edge. So here you need to keep in mind that each node of this BDT is a persistence pair with a birth and death, which we encode in the nodes as well. And in the rest of the talk, when I use the term branch, I'll be referring to a node in the BDT or equivalently to branch in the merge tree. So there's one more important thing that I'd like to mention, because we'll use it later on, is that each branch in the BDT has a birth-death interval, which is included in the birth-death interval of its parent by construction. And we call this the nesting property of BDTs. And this can be visualized in the branch decomposition. Basically, each segment here is included in this interval here. And this is a direct consequence of the elder rule. And we'll use this later on to revert this operation. So overall, the BDT on the left captures exactly the same information as the diagram, but with additional structure. So in practice, yes?
Could I ask a quick question to clarify? Sure. Right here? So I'm a little bit confused why the information on the left is exactly identical on the right, because it seems to me that the picture on the left BDT, it shows the intersection of each branch to the main branch. So that information is recovered. Where is the ordering of the branch in terms of how it's merged with the main trunk? Where is that encoded in the BDT?
So basically, each branch in the main tree here is represented by a node, and the way the branches are connected, so the horizontal segments here are represented by those edge in color. And those edge in white, sorry. So here, basically, you have a green branch that merges with the light blue branch, and this is represented just by this single white. Right.
That part I did get, but the question is that on the right, in the merge tree, there's an ordering of how the branches is merged with the main trunk. How is that ordering preserved on the left?
So on the left, we decided to order. So it happens that on this view, this is also ordered from left to right, but I suspect that in this display, this is ordered by persistence. I don't remember exactly. It happens that it coincides. But what is important to remember is that for each node, we store in the node the birth and death values of the feature. So from that, you can retrieve everything.
Okay, so it's augmented
as
part of the structure to make sure nothing is lost.
Absolutely, absolutely. Okay, cool. This is one thing that I tried to mention before. Okay. So in practice, the BDTs are known to be a little bit unstable due to a phenomenon that's called the saddle swap, which I will show now. So on the bottom here, you see a slight variation of the same data set where we just tilted the y-axis a little bit, which results in different data values. And of course, this results in a slightly different branch decomposition. And if you look at the BDT, clearly now the two BDTs are not isomorphic, which can be a problem in practice. And this is due to this black branch here that decided to merge first with this dark blue branch before merging with the light blue branch. And to account for this, an established strategy consists in moving up the BDTs, the subtrees for which the difference in saddle value with our parent is smaller than a given threshold epsilon 1. And if you do this, this will have the effect of, translating this, moving this higher in the tree, higher in the hierarchy. So basically, this branch in black will go to the main branch here. And in the BDT, the branch that was here will move up in the tree. And at this point, the BDTs are isomorphic. So there's also a vast literature regarding merge trees, in particular in the visualization community, where it's been studied over the last 20 years with various applications, including data summarization and segmentation. So several metrics have been introduced, including a prominent work by Sridhara Murthy in 2020, where the authors specialized in the specific case of merge trees, a classical algorithm from the graph matching literature by Zhang in 1996. In short, this approach introduces costs for editing a merge tree to turn it into another. And the edit distance between the two trees is given by the sum of the edit costs. However, this work is not really conducive to a simple computation of geodesics, and I will show this now. So let's consider two data sets, Fi and Fj, along with their merge trees, Ti and Tj. And the edit distance between the merge trees considers edit operations between the nodes of the tree based on the global assignment optimization. And it is possible that the assignments returned by the optimization map an extremum node in one tree to a saddle node in the other. And this is shown here with the red spheres. And now if you try to interpolate the optimized assignments to obtain a midpoint, which would be the tree in black, it turns out that this in-between tree is not located on a geodesic between Ti and Tj. And this is illustrated in this top view, where the numbers next to the edges are the actual edit distances computed with this algorithm. And here clearly the path through the black tree is not the shortest path. And of course, this is something that we addressed in our work. And this would be the in-between tree that we compute with our method. So Gasparovich and colleagues introduced an interleaving distance between merge trees, given a user-defined labels or correspondences between the leaves. And it's been used by Jan and colleagues for the computation of one-centers, which minimize their maximum distance to a set. But so there's a classical drawback with one-centers. It's their sensitivity to outliers. And in this example, we consider 10 variants of this Gaussian mixture with some random noise, and we consider this outlier, which has a drastically different merge tree, this one right here. And the one center computed by the approach of Jan will typically be located equally far from both types of trees as can be expected, whereas barycenters, particularly computed with our approach, can be much less sensitive to those outliers. All right, so now I'll introduce our distance between merge trees. And the goal of our approach was to introduce a distance which is computable in practice on real-life data sets, and ideally in polynomial time. And also we wanted fast computations of geodesics, ideally by interpolations and practical computation of barycenters. So for this, what we did is that we started with the edit distance, and we adapted it in order to bridge the gap to the tools already existing for the Wasserstein metric for diagrams. And the first step is to switch representations and to use the Bdt instead of the merge trees. The original edit distance between merge trees directly operates on the critical nodes of the trees, with possible inconsistencies in terms of critical index, as we saw before. And instead, in our work, we propose to map branches to branches. And in particular, we'll introduce the notion of partial assignment between Bdts, just the same way we did for persistence diagrams before. And specifically, we have a partial assignment that is given as a bijective map between a branch subset Bi of the first Bdt to a branch subset Bj in the other. And the sets Bi bar and Bj bar are the remaining branches that will be destroyed. So next, we'll introduce edit costs based on a ground metric in the birth-death space, again, in order to stick to the diagram case. And for this, we'll use the L2 norm between branches. And the cost of matching a branch to another will be given by the Euclidean distance in their birth-death space. And the cost of deleting or creating a branch will be given by this distance to its diagonal projection. All right. So now we need to define the search space for the optimization of the partial assignments. And to enable a polynomial optimization algorithm for the distance computation, we will constrain the space of valid assignment. And first we do the same thing as Zhang and Sridhar Murthy did. We only consider partial assignments which map subtrees, disjoint subtrees to disjoint subtrees. And in short, this means that we will not allow branches to travel up the tree and then go down to another subtree. And next, we'll add another constraint to the search space on top of what was done in previous work. And this is motivated by our goal to compute geodesics efficiently. In particular, we impose that if a branch is destructed in a BDT, all of its subtree is destructed as well. So here's an example of a partial assignment which satisfies these constraints. This is shown in red in the background of the trees. And in short, given these constraints, you can show that the valid assignments have to be partial isomorphisms between the two BDTs. And they also have to map the root of one tree to the root of the other. And this is why we call these partial rooted isomorphisms. So this is a very restricted set of candidates.
And so the red there is showing the matching, right? So B4 is not matched with B4.
Here you have two trees, one in green, one in blue, and the matching is shown with a red background. So basically it says in this example that B1 is mapped to B1 prime, and B4 prime, for instance, is destroyed.
Yep. Okay, cool. Thanks.
So now I will move on to the expression of the distance. So initially, when I introduced the distance between diagrams, I split the terms artificially into mapping, destruction, and creation. And to obtain our distance from that, we just need to change the search space and the ground metric. So we simply define our distance as follows. We have the sum of the squares of edit operations on the branches, and we optimize this sum over the set of partial rooted isomorphisms. And here, as a reminder, the edit costs are precisely based on the L2 norm in the birth-death space. So really, what you end up having here is literally the same expression as for diagrams, but the only thing that changes at the end is the search space, which takes into consideration the structure of the BDTs. And this is why we call that a Wasserstein distance. So the distance is a metric, and the detailed arguments for that are given in the manuscript. Since the solution space is smaller than for diagrams, it turns out that the Wasserstein distance between merged trees indeed bounds by above the distance between the Wasserstein distance between diagrams. And this was exactly our initial goal, to get a distance which differentiates data sets better. And at one point, we introduced a pre-processing of the BDTs to account for saddle swaps in practice. And this pre-processing was controlled by a parameter epsilon1, which is a normalized difference in data value between saddles that you can see here. And what is interesting here is that when epsilon1 is set to 1, basically all the branches are moved up the tree and become direct children of the root of the BDT. And then it turns out that the two distances exactly coincide. And this is pretty convenient in practice, because now we can see this parameter as a weight, as a control knob, to control the importance of the structure of the tree. So when epsilon1 is equal to 1, the structure is ignored, and we have the classical distance between diagrams. And when it's set to 0, the full structure of the tree constrains the search space.
Sorry, can I?
Is there some scale here? Like, is the lowest node at 0 and the highest node at 1, or?
So basically, this is normalized. So it's between 0 and 1, and 1 would be the full persistence of the root here.
Gotcha.
Okay. So since the search space is smaller than the one described by Zhang, we came up with an extension of the algorithm, which discards many unnecessary evaluations. And it's also expressed in terms of tasks to leverage shared memory parallelism. So in the end, we have a very efficient parallel algorithm for the computation of this polynomial problem. Unfortunately, I don't believe I have time to get into the details, but I invite you to check out the manuscript that contains full descriptions. All right, so now I'll move on to the geodesics. So given two BDTs and a optimal assignment between them, we'd like to compute a sort of in-between BDT, B alpha, with alpha between 0 and 1. where B0 equals to Bi and B1 equals to Bj. And since we restricted the search space to partial isomorphisms, what happens is that the structure of the subtrees of Bi and Bj, which are mapped through phi prime, actually doesn't change, since phi prime is an isomorphism between subtrees, as we saw before. And that's really the key for simple interpolations. So once this is established, we just need to interpolate the birth-death values of the branches, and the structure of the matched trees doesn't change because it's simply an isomorphism. And for this, the location of the birth-death space of an interpolated branch B, B alpha, will be given by simply the linear interpolation of the location of the branch B to the branch it maps to. And similarly for these branches which will be destroyed, we use linear interpolation between the original branch and their diagonal projection. And we have the symmetric operation for branch creation. From a practical point of view, an interesting thing is that this very simple linear interpolation actually describes a geodesic, and also the details are given in the paper. But the cool thing is that once you computed the distance, you can get the geodesic estimation in linear time by just doing those very simple interpolations. All right, so here's a little subtle detail. So now we showed how to compute geodesics between Bdts, and what we'd like to do is to go back to our original merge tree representation. And unfortunately, this is not as direct as we could wish. And for that, we'll consider two data sets, Fi and Fj, that illustrates that. And here you have the Bdts of the first data set from the left and the Bdt from the right. And here you have the interpolation that we get with our algorithms. So those two branches are mapped and this one is destroyed. So now to get the in-between merge tree, in principle, we just need to take each black node and represent it with a vertical bar and add the horizontal segment between adjacent branches in the Bdt. And it turns out that this is not trivial to do for this one. If we do this, we realize somehow that the merge tree we obtain in black gets disconnected, which seems inconsistent, because if we take the Bdt of that black tree, now we should have a disconnected Bdt, which is not what we had in the first place out of the interpolation. So the problem comes from the fact that this bottom branch gets destructed along the geodesics. And later when it gets interpolated, this interpolation is somehow independent of the rest of the tree, which continues to move up. So this independent interpolation violates the nesting property that we described in the first place. It violates the elder rule. So we need to modify our algorithm to take that into account. And this is what we'll do next. So basically, we need to have a sort of destruction of the branch that is following the movement of the parent. So the solution that we opted for is fairly easy. So here, this is the nesting condition. Again, if you have a branch here, basically its birth-death interval has to be included in that of its parent. And what we decided to do is to do a pre-normalization strategy where we normalize the interval of each branch based on its parent, as shown here, where nx is the normalized birth and ny is normalized death. And then we compute our distance in our interpolation based on these normalized intervals. And after that, we revert recursively the normalization. And then with this recursive inverse normalization, we have the nesting condition that is enforced constructively. In practice, we have the normalization process subject to a few parameters that we introduced to optimize things a little bit in order to control the normalized persistence of small features. So every subtree with a persistence smaller than a threshold epsilon 3 are moved up the Bdt if their persistence is larger than a fraction epsilon 2 of their parents. But at the end of the day, we realized that those two parameters didn't have much importance, and we optimized them on our data sets, and we came up with default values that we use throughout our experiments. Really, the most important parameter is this one here. Okay, so now we'll move on to the computation of barycenters. So now we have an ensemble of Bdts, and I'd like to find a local minimizer of the fresh energy, which is simply the sum of the distances to the Bdts of the ensemble. And for this, we simply adapt the assignment update algorithm introduced by Turner and colleagues in the case of diagrams. So at each iteration, we compute the optimal partial isomorphisms between the candidate B and the Bdts of the ensemble. And once this is done, we need to update the candidate B under the current assignments in order to decrease the fresh energy. And this is done by generalizing our interpolation scheme to more than 2 Bdts as follows. So basically, each branch of the candidate is moved to the arithmetic mean of its assignments. And this is guaranteed to decrease the fresh energy for the current assignments, as we are using the L2 norm as a ground metric, and that arithmetic means do minimize fresh energies in Euclidean spaces. So by updating the barycenter like that, we're guaranteed to decrease the fresh energy, and then we iterate over. So once the candidate is updated, we start a new iteration all over, and this is guaranteed as well to decrease overall the fresh energy constructively. And in practice, we stop the iterations when the energy has decreased by less than 1% between two consecutive iterations. And here again, we exploit our task-based algorithm for distance computation to spread the load among the computation load among different trees. But again, more details in the paper if you are interested in the computational aspects. Okay, so I will briefly describe a few experiments now. So first, I'd like to describe the data sets that we considered, and all of them are available at this address at the top here. So we considered 12 ensembles, which were made publicly available in the context of the IEEE SciVis contest. So this is an analysis contest which is co-located every year with IEEE Viz, which itself is a reference venue for data visualization. So each ensemble counted a few dozen members, each with a classification ground truth, which was given by the application. And the merge trees counted between dozens to thousands of branches. And all of the curation scripts to download the data, to pre-process it, and to label it with the ground truth information, all of that is available in the GitHub repository listed up there. And as you'll see next, the ensembles come from a variety of fields. So first, I'll report some timings in seconds for the computation of the barycenter merge tree with our approach. And here I will simply focus on the parallel execution on a recent desktop machine. And here execution times, of course, varied depending both on the number and of merge trees and their sizes. But overall, for the largest ensembles here, so about 50 data sets and about 2,000 branches per merge tree, the computation took at most 15 minutes. And since we published this work, we actually have improved the implementation a little bit. And the code, which is in TTK, is about 3 times faster. So in short, for these data sets, it should take at most 5 minutes on a recent machine. All right. So now we evaluate the robustness of a metric, in particular the stability to perturbations. And for that, we consider data set Fi. We consider next variations, Fj, where we add a random noise of progressive amplitude, which is expressed as a percentage of the original data range. And we keep going like this, and we have this continuous sampling of noise amplitudes ranging from 0 to 100% of the original data range. And we study the evolution of our distance between the noisy variance, Fj, and the reference, Fi. And this will tell us somehow how stable our metric is regard to input perturbations. So this is reported in the curves that you can see to the right, where the x-axis is the noise amplitude and the y-axis is our distance. And there's 5 different curves for 5 different values of the parameter epsilon1. And as we saw before, this parameter controls, in short, the depth of the subtrees subject to saddle swaps. So when epsilon1 is equal to 1, all the branches are moved up to the root, and our metric becomes equivalent to the L2 Wasserstein distance between diagrams. And this is this light blue curve that you can see here at the bottom. And this confirms experimentally that this metric is stable since the distance increases linearly with the noise. And at the other side of the spectrum, when you don't do that, for epsilon 1 equals 0, you have the full initial structure of the tree which is taken into account, and a slight variation in the data can induce a Bdt which is not isomorphic to the reference, as we saw at the beginning. So here for the gray curve, a slight variation can induce a large distance. So what's interesting here is that for the in-between values, we observe a balance between the two behaviors. With those transition points, this is where things start to diverge from the stable cases. And another thing that is interesting is that if we increase just a little bit this epsilon 1, those transition points shift quickly to the right side. And if you take a reasonable noise level, let's say 16%, you only need a small value for that parameter. But really the important thing to remember is that this is a control knob to impose either more stability or more discriminative power to the metric. And this can be tuned on based on expectations on the noise levels. Right, so now I will briefly go over a few applications of our work to data analysis problems. A first application we'll consider is that of feature tracking in time-varying data sets, such as this 2D simulation of a ionization front in astrophysics. In this context, the optimal assignment phi between the consecutive persistence diagrams can be used to track local maxima from the left here to the right. However, this can lead to inconsistencies, as you can see here in red, when features actually switch positions in the birth-death space. And this is what you have for those two guys here. Our metric improved this aspect a bit thanks to a more constrained search space, which better preserves the global structure of the data in this example. We have another application which we considered, which is data reduction for time series. And the idea here is that instead of storing the entire sequence of merged trees, we'd like to store only a small number of them and reconstruct the others by geodesic computation. So here you have a sequence of merged trees for a simulation of asteroid impact with the surface of the Earth, with the time given by the x-axis. And the idea is that we'll remove the merged tree that we can reconstruct the best with a geodesic, and we'll keep on removing greedily merged trees like that until we only maintain a user-specified number of keyframes. And this is what you have here. The merged trees with a cyan background here, for instance, are those which are reconstructed by geodesic computation, and the ones with the white background are the remaining keyframes. So here you can already see that the reconstructed merged trees are visually similar to the original ones. And to compare the two sequences, we can also plot the temporal evolution of their distance to the empty tree. So here you have time, and here this is the distance to the empty tree. But what is interesting in this example is that the four remaining keyframes that are identified by the algorithm are located in one of the pre-identified phases of the simulation, namely the initial state here, the approach, the impact, and the aftermath of the impact. So those are the figures that correspond. Okay, so now we have an algorithm to compute barycenters. It's pretty easy to derive an algorithm for clustering ensembles directly in this metric space of merged trees. So for that, we just need to consider k-mins. And so this algorithm iteratively alternates assignments and updates between the input and k centroids. So here for merged trees, we just need to use our distance as a metric and our barycenter computation to obtain the centroids, and the rest of the algorithm is exactly the same. So for that, we considered an ensemble of time steps of a simulation of dark matter density from astrophysics. And for each time step, we computed the merged tree. And next, we applied our topological clustering algorithm with k equals 4. And the output clustering is denoted in this picture by the color of the frames. So for instance, A here and B here are in the same cluster, C and D are in the same cluster, and so on and so forth. And here, each cluster indeed corresponds to a continuous sequence in the time series. So the clustering provided by the algorithm is consistent with the ground truth. So next, we compute a distance matrix based on our metric, and we use this as an input for multidimensional scaling, and we represent with a point in 2D each member of the ensemble. And again, the color corresponds to the clustering. And the larger sphere at the center are the centroids computed by algorithm, and you can see what they correspond to. And you can see that they indeed capture the main features observed in the trees of the clusters, and they can be used as sort of visual summary for the trees of that cluster. And additionally, we color-coded the branches here according to the assignment from a tree of the cluster to the barycenter. So really it says that this branch, when computing the distance, is mapped to that one. And when computing the distance to the barycenter, this one is computed to that one. So you can use this visualization of the mapping to even compare the trees of the clusters. And here in this example, you see that A and B have the same structure with three prominent features. The key difference here is that those appear to be longer, and that you can visualize with this color coding. All right. So you can try all of these algorithms. They are integrated in the latest release of TTK, the topology toolkit. You can install it with the binary packages that are provided on the website, or you can also simply get it by installing the latest version of PowerView, which is a major data analysis and visualization platform, which includes TTK since the version 5.10. To try out the work, you can go to the TTK example website, which includes dozens of examples of topological data analysis pipelines with TTK. And for each example, you have a screenshot, a quick description of the pipeline, a command line to reproduce exactly the screenshot, and a Python snippet that you can literally copy-paste to your Python command line to reproduce the example. And for instance, you can check out the example for merge tree clustering shown here, or the temporal reduction. Okay, so overall, we introduced a unified computational framework for a fast computation of distances between merge trees and geodesics and barycenters. We presented 3 applications of our work to ensemble data analysis, where we showed that this could be useful. And our paper got a replicability stamp. So in short, it means that you can download the exact code and the exact data that we used for the manuscript, and you can reproduce our experiments. And this has been certified by independent reviewers of the replicability stamp initiative. So finally, we believe there are several perspectives to this work which are worth studying, and obvious future directions include the extension of this framework to other descriptors, such as the RIP graph, or also to have more advanced ensemble analysis features. And that's pretty much it. That concludes the talk. So thanks for your attention, and I'd be happy to take questions.
Great. So before we get to questions, please briefly unmute yourself and let's applaud for the speaker.
Thanks.
Questions for Julien?
I have 2 questions, if that's okay. I'll try to make them quick.
Okay.
So the first one is more on topic. So with persistence diagrams, there's somehow there are these geodesics, but it's a well-known failure of uniqueness for geodesics. Do you believe in the metric that you developed that it's somehow more unique, the geodesics?
Yes and no. First, since basically, as you saw, really it's the same expression, the same interpolation. It's just the search space that is smaller. So in principle, you could also have the same non-uniqueness in geodesic or even in barycenter. The only thing that changes here, like I said, is a search space. So maybe it's harder to get into those because the search space is smaller. But yeah, I would expect that it's possible to have exactly the same caveat. Yeah.
Okay, and the other quick question, this is a little bit more tangential. So working with BDTs, do you think there's a good way to vectorize a BDT, especially that has nice properties with respect to the metric? Because, you know, different metrics, different kind of stability properties. How would you vectorize this kind of data structure?
That's a very good question. I don't have an immediate answer to that. I will try to point to the literature doing vectorization of graphs for neural networks and stuff like that. Maybe there's some ideas to steal from them.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Hey, please go ahead.
May I ask
Julien, nice
question?
talk. So I have a question regarding this saddle shifting parameter. It seems so you made a comment at some point in your talk that parameter is not as important as you thought it would be. Did I miss that part or misunderstood it?
Maybe I was not clear enough. Let me try to go back to that slide really quick. Oh, this is way up. So basically there's three parameters. Yeah. There's one to control the saddle swap. And what I meant to say is that it's the one that has the most importance. And this is what is shown in practice on this experiment right here. You can have drastically different result. The other one, there were two parameters, epsilon2 and epsilon3. And their idea is to control, since we have to normalize the birth-death intervals to make sure that the transition from merge tree to branch to BDT is invertible. And this normalization somehow can produce very large normalized persistence for small features. So we have those two extra parameters to control that. But at the end, this is a bit technical, but since I didn't talk of the algorithm, but you have to understand the matching algorithm as trying to do local assignments between branches once a root of the subtree is mapped. So it's those two parameters, epsilon2 and epsilon3, which are not as important as epsilon1.
And epsilon1 is a gap in the saddle.
Yes.
I remember. Or epsilon. Okay, but in here, this is so maybe that's where my confusion is. I saw this one epsilon is the injection of noise, not the parameter for the saddle.
I'm sorry. So the x-axis is the noise, and the different epsilon1 values correspond to the different curves.
Right, but is this epsilon1 here the saddle parameter?
Yes.
Oh, I see. Okay, I thought this epsilon was sort of injected noise.
So here on the x-axis is the level of noise that you introduce.
Yeah.
And the different curves corresponds to the computations with different values of our input parameter.
I see. Okay, so in some sense, that saddle is very sort of important that dedicate how this behaves.
Absolutely, absolutely. And basically, like I said, here at the bottom, you have the classical distance between diagrams that evolve linearly. This is what you would want. And then you have this panorama, this spectrum of behaviors in between when you go from 0 with this parameter and that you increase it. And so what is it? Like I said, it's a sort of control knob if you want to control more the stability or the discriminative power of the metric. But in the end, here you see you're very close to that curve for a reasonable value of epsilon1.
Okay, all right, thanks.
All right, Alexander, please go ahead.
Hi, thanks for the great talk. I was just wondering if you've considered, I guess what you'd call like merge forests instead of merge trees.
Can you clarify a bit?
Yeah, so instead of having a function defined on, I guess, like a connected simplicial complex, where at the end you get just one node in the merge tree, if you have a function defined on a disjoint union.
Oh, well, my immediate answer would be to compute distances between disjoint sets. So basically, you process each connected component of tree independently, and
And so for a distance, if you wanted to compute a distance using your ideas between two
disconnected sets.
You could compute the distance between each pair, and then optimize over another matching of. Okay.
Actually, we could use the same idea of matching components to components, or destroying a component altogether, or creating one altogether. Yeah. And I was a bit confused by the question, because in the details of the algorithm, they use the notion of forest pretty similar, actually very similarly to map subtrees to subtrees. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Hussein, please go ahead with your question.
So can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah, thank you, Julien. Nice talk. So I have
Thanks.
very quickly 3 questions. The first question is, I didn't get the idea of this dual tree, because we usually introduce dual tree for, let's say, going from maximum problem to minimum problem or something like that. I didn't get this dual tree you introduced.
The what I call the Bdt.
Yeah. So yeah.
Let me see if I can go back really quick to an example where you see a slide where we can see the two next to each other. Okay, right here. So here, this is a merge tree, and it's represented in a layout where you can see the branches. This is another one. The idea is that each vertical bar is a connected component of subcomplex. And in this dual tree, we represent each bar is represented now by a node.
My main question is that we usually in graph theoretical society introduce the dual for going from, let's say, the maximum problem to turn it to minimum problem, or vice versa.
Mm-hmm.
What is the idea here?
So the idea here is that a bar is just represented by a node. This is why I use the term dual loosely. But the goal really is, for the rest of the algorithm, to switch representation a little bit to make sure that what we are trying to optimize in our assignments are persistence pairs.
Okay, thank you.
Because
And Hussein, we'll go to questions from others first, if that's okay.
Next turn.
Yeah, just in case folks need to leave.
Sorry.
So Raghavendra, please go ahead.
Yeah, hi. Am I audible?
I can hear you. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so one question is, you are considering the branch decomposition tree. And here the branch decomposition tree is based on the persistence and the nesting property of the persistence, as in the intervals are nested.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So if we have other branch decompositions trees, so there can be many branch decomposition trees, right? It's not like only one. So if this nesting property doesn't hold, then we will have a problem, right? Have you thought about it?
Thanks for the question. By the way, I hope I didn't mispronounce your family name earlier.
It's okay, no problem.
But yeah, that's a great point. And this is why we focused on what we called persistent branch decomposition, where we construct those branch by following path between the critical points creating the pair, the structure. But in the literature, if you are interested in merge trees, you will see that other authors introduced a more generic notion of branch decomposition, where you use other criteria than persistence to do this decomposition. And of course, everything that I said here doesn't fly anymore if you use those other branch decompositions, the interpolation and the barycenter and so on. There's a paper from 2014 that introduces also a metric between those more general branch decompositions from the folks from UC Davis, but basically the search space is much larger then, because this is exactly what they try to do. Yeah.
Thanks.
George, please go ahead.
Hi, very, very nice work. Thank you so much. I feel kind of bad circling back to the question about epsilon, but
Like
I work in an area where I work in audio, and so there's a lower and a higher end for the kind of values that we get naturally out of our data, and that gives us a natural sampling. So I understand how I could set E1 to correspond to my sampling, but I'm still sort of confused what intuition I should develop for the other two, especially because you said it has to do with normalization. So my suspicion it has to do with the coarse grain boundary of my range. But if you could try to give another explanation of this, it would be very helpful.
Yeah. So for epsilon 1, you said that was clear, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So let me go to the second one. If I can find my cursor again. Okay. So they were introduced here. So basically, the idea here is that if this, imagine the branch that you have here happens to be nearly as large as its parent. When you normalized its birth-death interval, all of a sudden, the interval would be close to 1, and you may think that this tiny feature is very persistent. So basically, we introduced those thresholds to modify the Bdt a little more by moving those guys up the tree to make sure that tiny features don't have too much of an importance in the match. At the end of the day, like I was trying to say to Bay earlier, is that since all those assignment problems at the end are very local to subtrees, you end up comparing features which in practice have kind of the same persistence. So this is not very important. But the way we had those values is that we just optimized them on a classification problem. And that's pretty much the brute force way we had those values. Knowing that basically if you have 1 for those 2 parameters, you have no effect at all.
So maybe, is the use of these parameters, the equation for them, is it in the paper? Can I just read that up in the paper?
Oh, yeah. Okay. Obviously, and you also have, actually, it's a question that puzzled the reviewers as well. So we had some more additional material at the end of the paper where we show the impact on the metric when we tune those things, and we give more explanations.
Just from what you said, I have sort of the suspicion that really E1 is a different beast than these other two, and they all are called epsilon, but like some are rescaling entities and others are thresholding. Is that correct?
No. So basically, they're exactly the same kind of beasts. Okay. You want to measure a relation between the persistence of a branch and its parent, and you use that decision to move the branch up the tree.
Okay.
To change
I'll
a bit.
have to read a paper. Yeah. That's fine. I'll try to get it out of the paper. Thanks so much. Very nice work.
Oh, thank you.
So let's stop the recorded portion, at least here. I think we'll have some more questions afterwards. But thanks again, Julien, for a really nice talk. And thanks, everybody, for all the nice questions.
Thanks.